So whether the actual divinity of Christ is being taught in John 1:1 has been a point of interpretive contention. The Jehovah's Witnesses New World Translation translates the last part of this verse as the word was a God. Why the difference between God and a God, you might ask? Well, I want to help with answering this. The critical linguistic question, often leveled by those who do not see Jesus as equal in divinity to the Father, relies heavily on the argument that there's not a definite article before theos at the ending of John 1:1. Is this lack of a definite article, in fact, a valid point to be made? The quick answer is absolutely not, but the lengthier answer is what follows. I'd like to give some answers to those who may have no understanding of original languages and would therefore potentially be confronted and possibly misled by wondering if somehow your translation is somehow hiding a more correct reading or not interpreting the text correctly because the later Christian tradition demands it. Well, I say often in my videos, and will continue to say, that context matters. Any and all passages must be read in the context that they were written and in the context of what the writer as a whole was trying to convey. The good thing for us is that John's pretty clear with what he's doing, especially in regards to the divinity of Jesus, and that will help clear up any possible interpretive issues with this text. As we're going to see, verse 1 is carefully crafted and must be understood within its context, and that it actually is a key to understanding later parts of John's account. First, in John, and this cannot be missed, he's desirous of his readers to hear echoes from Genesis with his use of in the beginning. John is recording the recreation of humanity, if you will, and in fact, even has Jesus breathing on the disciples in John 20, verse 22, in an obvious parallel to Genesis 2, verse 7. John shows the light shining into darkness into a parallel to Genesis 1, 2, and 3. He also uses 7 days, if you count very carefully, to open up the gospel account through the beginning of chapter 2 in correspondence to the 7 days of creation. He's also the only gospel to record the literary correspondence of the spear that was thrust into Jesus' side and where the water and the blood that created his bride, the church, came from. It parallels that to Adam's wounding in the garden that created his bride. The usage of the Genesis account as a backdrop has not been missed by the majority of scholarship. Second, John doesn't just simply have one statement in John 1:1 that could possibly be open to misinterpretation about the divinity of Jesus, but is consistent with the divinity of Jesus all the way through his account. For instance, Jesus uses the Old Testament divinity statement, I am, concerning himself in places like John 8:24, 28, 58, and 13:13. And in John 10:30, he's one with God. Also in John 20:28, Thomas refers to the Lord as my Lord and my God. So the literary idea of Jesus being divine is consistent throughout the whole epistle. I'll come back to this literary theme of the divinity of Christ in a moment and how what is recorded in John 1:1 actually develops the whole theme. Next, let's focus a little more on why John has written verse 1 the way he has by breaking down the 3 parts of the verse. John starts off verse 1 with en arche en ha logos, which is clearly written with the backdrop of Genesis in mind. This is intentional as it frames his use of the Logos as pre-existent. The Logos was in the beginning. He was not a created being nor an intermediary, which his contemporaries might infer from the use of the word Logos. Let's be clear. He wants to make sure his readers know that his Logos was in the beginning and pre-existent when he states in the beginning. John's original readers might have wanted to know the answer to this question. Was the Logos with God or was he in fact God? John answers that question with both. So make sure to note that he is taking a referential word of the time and redefining it so his readers can understand better who Jesus is. John also makes clear in the way he employs the Greek words eimi and genomai in his gospel. Eimi is to be, genomai is to become. John is very careful to use eimi in all 3 times concerning the Logos in verse 1 for a reason. The Logos was, as in always, he was not becoming. We can see how carefully John uses these words with precision, specificity, and intentionality in a passage like John 8:58, where Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. Note, before Abraham was, genomai, I am eimi. He also makes this clear in John 1:1 when read in contrast with 1:6. Jesus was eimi, but there came a man sent from God and came as genomai. Remember, John had the vocabulary words he could have used to make Jesus a created being or an intermediary at his disposal, but he very carefully chose his words to make clear what he intended for his readers to understand, namely, that whatever we say about theos, we can say about logos. Next, John tells us that the logos was with God. The Greek for with is pros. Pros includes both a presence and special relationship. Pros is more than just with, but means in close proximity or face-to-face with. At the very least, pros is distinguishing the logos from theos while simultaneously holding their face-to-face relationship. This is important because John is here making the first steps towards what will eventually become Trinitarian theology by allowing the Logos to be face-to-face with God while also being God, as we'll see at the end of verse 1. Now we're ready to tackle the last part of verse 1 and whether the lack of a definite article should be taken to disprove the full divinity of the Logos. First, as a monotheistic Jew, it would be very hard to explain why John would refer to someone or something as God. As a quick aside, it's become sort of vogue in highly critical and liberal scholarship to say that the Jews were not monotheists. This is absurd. Were the Jews sometimes misguided and idolatrous? Yes. Were they monotheists? Of course. For John to use theos in reference to the Logos, this would have most definitely raised the eyebrows of his readers. Second, there's no real relationship between the Greek articles and the English articles, no matter how much one may try and convince you of this. As Grant Osborne notes, quote, the absence of the article in Greek rarely meant a, and it normally established an abstract aspect, namely, in this instance, that Jesus partook of divinity or godness, unquote. Third, the actual use of the definite article in the third part of John 1:1 would mess up John's entire line of reasoning up to this point. He isn't trying to say that God and the Word are the same person, but is making differentiation between the two, while at the same time holding to the absolute divinity of the Logos. His word choice makes total sense in context. In fact, the very word order, while not always probative in Koine Greek, is still key to the context because it reads kai theos in ha logos, or literally in English, and God was the Word. John is clear that who God is in his essence, the Word is, but they are also unique persons. Fourth, as Kostenberger rightly notes, quote, in Greek syntax, it is common for a definite nominative predicate noun preceding a finite verb to be without the article, so that it's illegitimate to infer indefiniteness from the lack of the article in the present passage, unquote. He also says, quote, the force of the anarthrous theos is probably not so much that of definiteness as that of quality. Jesus shared the essence of the Father, though they differed in person. This is obviously what John is doing within the context of the verse. Fifth, if John wanted his readers to see Jesus as a lesser deity or not fully God, there was Greek vocabulary that he could have used. He didn't. Sixth, the very same thing, no article before theos, takes place in verse 18 of the same chapter, and nobody would dare translate this, no one has seen a God at any time. It's clear this means no one has seen God at any time. God here in verse 18 being understood as God and not some intermediary or lesser deity or some lesser God because of the lack of the article. I say all of this to get to my real point, and that is the context of John. One can't understand the part of a book without the whole. I say often to my students, don't start to exegete one passage in a book until you know the book in its entirety, or you're likely to massively misinterpret it. In this instance, as in many books in antiquity, John starts off his work with an interpretive key for the rest of his book, and that key is the Word was with God and the Word is God. This sets the stage for his readers to be prepared to see the Logos, who was with God and who is God, in the person of Jesus in several future passages. For some examples of this, we're told in John 5:39 that the Old Testament scriptures are about Jesus. How can this be? There's no way this could be true unless Jesus was with God and is God. In John 12:41, we are told that Isaiah said these things because he saw his glory and spoke of him. How could Isaiah see Jesus? Jesus is actually in the Old Testament? Who is this Jesus? Well, see, the readers set up to see this because Jesus is with God and is God in John 1:1. How else could Isaiah have seen Jesus unless he was both with God and is God? In John 13, we're told that Jesus, knowing his time had come, knew he was going back to his original glory. How can a human Jesus go back to the glory which is reserved for God alone? What does this mean? Well, the reader's ready to answer this because Jesus was with God and is God. John also expects us to see in the foot washing of chapter 13 that Jesus uses the same phrase spoken by God himself in Exodus 3, I am. Jesus says in John 13:13, you call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for I am. The same I am in Exodus 3 that had Moses remove his shoes has now removed the shoes of the disciples. John 1:1 readies the reader to make this connection that Jesus is both with God and God. Of course, the final culmination comes with Thomas's confession of Jesus being his Lord and his God in John 20, verse 28. So the Christian tradition of the divinity of Jesus is safe in John 1:1. And the Chalcedon Confession is the appropriate reading of texts like this. The divinity of Christ is not a later convention being retrojected into the interpretation of John 1:1, but is the carefully crafted intention of the entire Johannine account. you can be absolutely certain that John 1:1 says that Jesus is God. The larger question is, what will you do with that claim? Because it has massive consequences.